everyone, welcome back to Quiet Calm Books, a quiet, safe space to talk about books. I have some fairly exciting news for my channel, and that is that I finally got a real microphone, so hopefully that will eliminate some of the echoing or static or other weird background noise that you've heard in my previous videos. I live in a New York apartment where the ceilings are very high, so some of that is unavoidable, but hopefully the sound quality is a little better. Today's video is going to be a little different and maybe not as calm as usual, since we're going to be talking about books that actually terrify us in honor of Halloween. I have quite the selection of spooky books to share with you today, all of which I've read myself and found to be decently scary. The reason it's so difficult to find scary books that are actually scary is because our standards are so high. Books are never going to be as scary as horror movies. The pictures in our heads are not as vivid as gore on screen, and words cannot startle us as effectively as jump scares can. But one thing books can do is get into our heads, dig deep into our innermost fears, and leave us unable to sleep for days. That's why I've compiled a list of books I've read that are actually scary, not because they have the most gore or ghosts, but because they resonate with some of our deepest and darkest psychological fears. And don't worry, I'll throw in a couple of fun Halloween titles at the end too, so let's jump right into it. Starting off with a thoroughly disturbing book that is technically classified as a thriller, but which I consider more of psychological horror, we have Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn. If you're afraid of toxic families, being stuck in a small town, or losing control of yourself, then Sharp Objects is really going to get under your skin. Gillian Flynn is one of my favorite thriller writers of all time, and while most people know her as the author of Gone Girl, Sharp Objects is a bit less well known. Gone Girl could have easily made this list, but I personally found Sharp Objects to be slightly more disturbing, if you can believe that. The book follows a journalist from Chicago, Camille Preaker, who returns to her rural hometown of Wind Gap, Missouri. Her newspaper needs a big break, and so she's sent to investigate the disappearance of two young girls from her town. She's forced to temporarily move back in with her distant mother and a somewhat creepy 13-year-old half-sister who seems to be loved and feared by everyone in the town. Camille finds herself returning to something of a high school mentality as she's forced to adjust back to her old life. As she continues to investigate the girls, she realizes that their disappearances might be connected to her own past. This book explores the two strongest human emotions, fear and love, and reveals the absolute worst of what a human being is capable of doing in an attempt to gain love and attention. Small towns have been known to occasionally traumatize their residents and catch innocent children in their web of lies, family history, and expectations, and the town of Wind Gap is no different. Gillian Flynn really captures the dangers of a city girl returning to the hometown she ran away from. All of the characters in this book are terrifying in their own way, and I honestly couldn't tell you which one scared me the most. The author also makes great use of body horror and a loss of control as tools for terror, so if that is something that is terrifying to you, or possibly one of your worst fears, if body horror really bothers you, maybe you want to give this book a go if you actually want to be terrified. If small towns creep you out and you don't like the thought of losing control as a result of being stuck in one, then Sharp Objects is a great read to keep you up at night on Halloween. Next up, I don't think I could do a spooky book recommendation video without at least one Stephen King title, and the book I've chosen is The Shining. I've only read 2 Stephen King books in total. I've read The Shining and I've read Christine, so clearly I'm no expert, but there's something about this book that feels very nostalgic and Halloween-y, not to mention that Stephen King is the most well-known horror author of all time. So I'm going to recommend this book for you if you're afraid of going insane, hallucinating, or losing sense of what's real. If that's the case for you, then The Shining is probably going to give you nightmares. Like I said earlier, and especially for a lot of Gen Z readers, it's difficult to find actually scary books because we grew up watching scary movies with intense special effects and gore. And that's one thing that surprised me about Stephen King after hearing that he is the greatest horror writer of all time. Many of his books actually rely on psychological fear rather than supernatural or body horror. And The Shining especially relies on psychological horror a lot more than I initially expected. Most people are familiar with the movie version of The Shining, and the two most iconic images, I would say, from the movie are probably the ghost twins in the hotel and Jack Torrance breaking down the door with an axe. but surprisingly most of the book is not so spooky or action-packed. Instead, we slowly follow Jack Torrance into insanity as he begins to hallucinate and lose sense of who he is, and somehow that's a lot scarier. For those who aren't familiar with The Shining, the book follows a writer named Jack Torrance who takes on a job as an off-season caretaker at the Overlook Hotel. Now, I don't know what it is about writers getting stuck in spooky locations, but if you like to write, you're probably doomed to have this happen to you at some point. So Jack Torrance moves into the Overlook Hotel with his family, his wife Wendy and his 5-year-old son Danny. The longer the family stays cooped up together in this hotel over the winter, the more strange things begin to happen. Danny Torrance, who has special supernatural abilities, begins to notice the changes in the hotel and in his father long before anyone else. A lot of horror books are set in the heat of summer or in fall, the spooky season, but The Shining is unique in that it's a winter horror book. So if you don't like the thought of being snowed in or getting stuck in a remote snowy place, then The Shining is definitely going to freak you out. Next up, I have a Japanese horror recommendation for you all. This is Out by Natsuo Kirano. If you're easily paranoid and afraid of murderers living among us, which honestly who isn't, then Out is a great read for you. Quick, important trigger warning to anyone interested in this book. Out has the most graphic descriptions of gore, blood, and murder that I have ever read in my entire life. It also includes sexual violence and honestly made me feel sick reading it most of the time. I just finished this book recently and I'm honestly still processing it because as gory and unsettling as it is, there's so much more to this book than just the shock factor. Out by Natsuo Kirano follows the lives of 4 women living in the Tokyo suburbs and working the night shift making boxed lunches at a factory. The women, Masako, Yoshie, Kuniko, and Yayoi, are each working at the factory as a result of serious financial hardship. Many are in debt and have children and grandchildren to take care of, and it's honestly heartbreaking to see the desperate states that they live in. After being fed up with his careless money spending and physical and verbal abuse, one of the women strangles her husband to death and asks her coworkers to help her get rid of the body and cover up the crime. Don't worry, this is not a spoiler, it is on the back of the book, and it happens very early on. Masako takes over as ringleader of the operation, and the women continue to live in fear of their crime being discovered. While the women do spend most of the book being paranoid, it's actually not overly suspenseful or full of action until the very end. So if you're looking for something that is constantly gripping rather than more of a psychological slow burn, if you will, then this might not be the book for you. This book is mostly terrifying because of how desperate the characters are, and how much I came to root for these strong women struggling financially but committing horrible crimes. This book also has some police procedural elements as the women try to avoid being investigated by the police, as well as a bit of an undercover gangster side story. The book is also surprisingly feminist, as these women are repeatedly pushed into the shadows and unable to move up in society, while the men around them continue to do so, leading to their desperate states. I didn't go into too much detail here, but if you're interested in underground Japanese society, you're easily paranoid, or afraid of graphic descriptions of murder and bodily disposal, then you should definitely read Out this Halloween. If you have similar fears of paranoia, serial killers, murder, or it unsettles you to think that the average person walks past a lot of serial killers in their lifetime, but you want something a little bit tamer than Out, I recommend The Devil in the White City by Erik Larson. This is a nonfiction book, which means that it won't be for everyone, and I personally don't read a lot of nonfiction myself, but Erik Larson is such a good storyteller that this book honestly feels like it could be a fictional story. The Devil in the White City tells the story of Chicago's 1893 World's Fair by following the stories of 2 men, Daniel Burnham, the architect behind the World's Fair, and H.H. Holmes, the infamous serial killer who walked amongst people unnoticed at the World's Fair and claimed the lives of 27 victims. Erik Larson's descriptions of the Chicago World's Fair through the eyes of its architect are so vivid and beautiful, and when contrasted with the descriptions of the murders that take place in H.H. Holmes' booby-trapped murder castle, it is truly unsettling. According to the book, the murder castle included soundproof rooms, secret passageways, and a labyrinth full of staircases and hallways to confuse his victims. If you want to simultaneously learn something new about one of Chicago's most defining moments in history and read about the terrifying deeds of a real-life serial killer, then definitely check out Devil in the White City. Okay, next up we have more of a supernatural horror and somewhat dystopian recommendation, which also happens to be my favorite book that I've read so far this year, and that is Severance by Ling Ma. If you're afraid of dead-end jobs or zombies, then Severance is the book for you to read this Halloween. This book perfectly captures the experience of being a millennial, working a soul-sucking corporate job, and becoming an office zombie. In this book, Candace Chen is a Bible product coordinator who escapes her life through materialism and technology while secretly dreaming of her own creative endeavors. A disease called Shen fever breaks out, turning people into literal zombies who decompose and rot away while they continue to carry out tasks from their previous life. Candace quickly finds herself as one of the only non-zombies left in America. As New York City becomes a ghost town, Candace captures the apocalypse in her photography, posting it on a blog called New York Ghost. I think what's most terrifying about Severance is that these zombies aren't violent or looking to eat brains. They are simply carrying on with their boring lives, unaware that they are brain dead. The author's voice in this book is so vivid and captivating, and Candace reflects on the immigrant experience, the millennial experience, and the experience of living in New York City, even as she watches it crumble. So if you're interested in NYC and want to experience living there, but with an apocalyptic sci-fi twist, then this book is perfect. Okay, so next we're moving away from books that are truly scary and into some more lighthearted Halloween reads. And I have changed my whole outfit and my background just for this occasion. I am now wearing my brand new Ghost Books shirt. It says books. And I think the only thing that would make it cuter is if they were holding little books. That would be adorable. And in my background, I now have my candy corn bat. I have my little skeleton planter named Skelly, and I have my little glass pumpkins, because I think it would just be a shame not to show you every single Halloween decoration that I own before I have to put them away and cry about it. So here they are. So first up we have Odd Thomas by Dean Koontz. Now, Odd Thomas is a book that is very close to my heart because it's the first truly paranormal book that I ever read. This is definitely more of a comedy mixed with thriller rather than horror, but I had to include it just because it's fun. Odd Thomas lives an ordinary life in the small desert town of Pico Mundo. He's 21 years old, has a girlfriend named Stormy, and works as a cook at a restaurant. If there's one thing that makes him odd, it's the fact that he can see the dead. The spirits that Odd sees are silent and don't communicate to him verbally, although they do sometimes appear to him in amusing ways, such as a ghost who lost his arm when he died and likes to make weird gestures with it. Sometimes the spirits warn Odd of imminent danger or help him solve crimes. One day, a stranger visits Odd's small town, accompanied by a mob of disturbing shadow spirits. Odd immediately recognizes that this means absolute catastrophe. I don't want to give too much away, but I really encourage anyone who enjoys paranormal stories and has a good sense of humor to check out this book. Now, of course, it's not all fun and silly because it is a thriller, so it also has its fair share of tense and heartfelt moments, but I think it's the perfect balance. Odd's view of his strange world is delightful and surprising, and the ending is especially shocking. The Odd Thomas series consists of 8 different books in total, but the first book in particular is my comfort book and definitely has Halloween-y vibes. Next up, we have a psychological and supernatural horror story that I'm sure is familiar to most of you because of the incredible show on Netflix, and that is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Now, as long as you don't go into this book expecting the modernized family drama and jump scare-filled adaptation from Netflix, this is a very spooky ghost story. You'll recognize most of the show's best lines. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone. Oh, I get chills literally every time I read that line or hear that line. amazing, and this book is definitely worth reading just for Shirley Jackson's writing because it is so haunting. The characters Luke, Theo, and Nellie are present in this book but differ in backstory and personality, so again, just don't expect the characters that you know from the show and enjoy this as a new ghost story. The book relies on psychological fear to create tension and to create a disturbing story, and it succeeds because no physical ghosts ever appear in this book. The book follows Dr. Montague, a scholar who arrives at Hill House looking for evidence of ghosts, as well as Theo, who acts as his assistant, Luke, who is set to inherit Hill House, and of course Nellie, who finds herself affected by the house more so than the others. If you can't tell from the synopsis, this is a really different story from the show, but Shirley Jackson and Mike Flanagan's stories are each terrifying in their own way. I listed this as a more fun Halloween-y book because the characters talk about ghosts so much and also sit around the fire telling spooky stories, but be warned that this is also a genuinely disturbing book with some pretty serious and scary themes. So if you're afraid of spooky houses or ghost hunting, then you definitely have to read and watch The Haunting of Hill House. Finally, we are finishing off with a more classic monster story. If you're a fan of Broadway musicals, then you've definitely heard of and are probably obsessed with The Phantom of the Opera. The Phantom is an iconic horror character, and you better believe that it is my personal favorite Broadway musical. It has an incredible and extremely catchy soundtrack, as well as my favorite romantic pairing, which is Christine and the Phantom. But The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux is much spookier. This gorgeous edition of The Phantom of the Opera from Barnes & Noble is my absolute favorite, and it even includes other Gothic tales from Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, Louisa May Alcott, and some others, and I just think that this cover, like the red and the black leather, and then these gold pages, it's just so extra, and I think The Phantom would definitely approve. Don't be intimidated by the size of this book or its 1909 publication date. This is a fairly easy read, it feels very modern, and also keep in mind that this edition includes a lot of other stories, so it is nowhere near this large. In the book, the setting of the opera house is described so beautifully, and we spend a lot more time in the spooky underground catacombs beneath the Paris Opera House, where the Phantom dwells, composing in secret, away from the prying eyes of people who might judge him based on his appearance. We also get a much clearer idea of the Phantom, Christine, and Raoul as characters compared to the musical, so it's definitely worth a read, even if you've seen the musical countless times. The ending of this book is also far less tragic, and I think a little bit crazier than the musical, as Eric creates terrifying traps for Christine and Raoul in the catacombs. So if you're looking for a more classic monster story that feels nostalgic and haunting, I would definitely recommend that you read or reread The Phantom of the Opera. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you all so much for listening to my spooky recommendations. My channel is still new, so if you're new here and want to see more content from me, please like this video and subscribe. Also, let me know in the comments if you read any of my recommendations, if you have any video recommendations for me, content that you want to see from me, or what your own favorite spooky book is. So with that, happy reading and happy Halloween. Bye!